What if the worst drug epidemic in American history was not an accident? What if the crack cocaine that destroyed entire communities, that sent hundreds of thousands of predominantly black Americans to federal prison under mandatory minimum sentences specifically calibrated to fall hardest on them, that turned functioning neighborhoods into war zones, that filled morgues and shattered families, and produced a generation of children who grew up with addiction as the ambient condition of their lives? What if its arrival in those communities was not the natural consequence of market forces, or moral failure, or the random cruelties of poverty? What if the supply chain that made it possible ran through a warehouse in Los Angeles, and a network of Nicaraguan exiles, and a covert CIA program, and a memorandum signed in Washington that legally exempted the people responsible from ever having to report what they knew? That memorandum exists. It is in the National Archives. A Senate committee investigated this in 1989 and confirmed the core of what it documents. A CIA inspector general conducted a 400-page investigation in 1998 and confirmed it further. A reporter at a regional newspaper documented it in 1996 with court transcripts and DEA files and the sworn testimony of the traffickers themselves, and named every person in the chain. Then something happened that requires careful attention. The same newspapers that had spent years ignoring the story ran coordinated attacks on the reporter who broke it, attacks informed, as the CIA's own inspector general later documents, by information the CIA itself provided to journalists. The reporter lost his job, he lost his career, he lost his house to foreclosure. He was found dead in December 2004 with 2 gunshot wounds to the head, and the coroner ruled it a suicide. The CIA Inspector General report that confirmed the essential truth of his reporting had been released 6 years earlier on a Thursday before a federal holiday weekend, receiving less than 1 day of significant press coverage before disappearing. Gary Webb was right. The documents prove he was right. The report that should have vindicated him was engineered to disappear, and the press that should have covered the vindication was the same press that had participated in his destruction. This is not a conspiracy theory. Every claim in this video comes from one of 4 sources: a congressional record, a declassified government document, a federal court ruling, or documented investigative journalism. No speculation, no anonymous sources, only what the documents say, only what the traffickers testify to under oath, only what the CIA's own inspector general confirms in writing. The story connects the CIA's covert war in Nicaragua to the crack epidemic in south-central Los Angeles, to the most racially disparate sentencing structure in federal criminal history. It connects the death of a reporter to the deliberate burial of the document that proved him right. It connects all of it to a 1982 memorandum signed by 2 men who agreed, in writing, that the CIA did not have to tell law enforcement when its assets were trafficking cocaine into American cities. There's a version of American history where this story does not exist, where the crack epidemic is a natural disaster, a market phenomenon, a cultural failure, a tragic convergence of addiction and poverty without a traceable institutional cause. That version is more comfortable. That version does not require naming specific officials or acknowledging that the government signed a document exempting itself from reporting its own assets drug trafficking. That version is the one in most history books and in most classroom discussions of the 1980s, and it is the version that the 3 most powerful newspapers in the country helped produce when they chose to attack Gary Webb rather than investigate what he found. This video is the other version, the documented version, the version with the FOIA'd memo and the sworn testimony and the 400-page IG report and the 2 gunshot wounds. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a like. The algorithm actively buries this kind of content. Let's start in Los Angeles, in 1980, before anyone has given what is coming a name. Event 1, Los Angeles, and the crack epidemic, 1980-1986. It is 1980. South Central Los Angeles is a working-class black neighborhood that most of the country has not thought about, and most of the country will not think about until the specific catastrophe that is coming makes it impossible to ignore. The neighborhood is not what the coming media coverage will eventually make it appear. It contains homeowners who have lived in the same house for 30 years and raised children who graduated from Dorsey and Jefferson and Fremont High, and went to Cal State or into the military or into the trades. It contains churches that anchor blocks and small businesses on Crenshaw Boulevard and Western Avenue that have been operating since the 1950s. It contains teachers and nurses and factory workers at the plants in Torrance and Long Beach, whose union wages have built the foundation of a black middle class in a city that spent decades trying to prevent exactly that. It also contains the structural damage that those decades of prevention have left behind. The neighborhood has been redlined, the discriminatory mortgage mapping practice through which banks refuse home loans in black neighborhoods, starving them of the investment capital that builds equity and wealth in other parts of the city. The schools are funded at lower rates than schools in the San Fernando Valley. The relationship between the Los Angeles Police Department under Chief Darrell Gates and the residents of South Central is not a relationship between a community and the institution that serves it. It is a relationship between an occupying force and the occupied. Darrell Gates runs the lap from 1978 to 1992. He is a believer in militarized policing. He creates SWAT, the Special Weapons and Tactics Unit, and deploys it in South Central with a frequency that residents experience as siege conditions. He creates crash community resources against street hoodlums, the department's anti-gang unit, which later emerges in the Rampart scandal as an operation whose methods include planting evidence, fabricating testimony, and systematic brutality against residents. Gates later describes crack cocaine addicts publicly, in congressional testimony, as physiologically different from other people, resistant to treatment, essentially beyond help. This is the public safety infrastructure protecting South Central in 1980. This is the context into which everything that follows arrives. The recession of 1981 to 1982 breaks whatever stability exists. The Reagan administration's early economic policies hit the manufacturing sector hard, and South Central is a manufacturing community. The factories close. The aerospace contractors Northrop, McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed cut shifts at their southern Los Angeles County facilities in waves that each produce another cluster of unemployed workers who are not, in the Los Angeles of 1982, going to find equivalent employment somewhere else. The unemployment rate in South Central rises to levels that make the city's official statistics look like a different country. Unemployment among young black men in some neighborhoods reaches 30%. The community that has built itself into stability over a generation watches that stability erode with a speed that no personal virtue or individual decision can resist. Into this landscape arrives something new. Crack cocaine is not a new substance in its chemistry. It is powder cocaine cooked with baking soda and water, converted into a smokable form that can be broken into $5 and $10 pieces. The conversion requires nothing more sophisticated than a kitchen pot. What is new is the economics. Powder cocaine at the prices circulating in 1982 is a product for professionals. Crack at $5 a rock is a product for anyone with $5. The drug is extraordinarily addictive. The high lasts under 10 minutes. The crash is severe enough that users seek the next hit almost immediately. The product generates returning customers at a rate that no legitimate business has replicated. It arrives in South Central around 1981 and 1982. Within 2 years, it has transformed the neighborhood in ways that residents describe, decades later, as watching a fire move from house to house with nobody calling the fire department. Addiction rates climb. The crime that funds addiction climbs with it. The violence that attends illegal market distribution reorganizes the street geography of South Central into territories whose boundaries are enforced by the only means a market without legal recourse can enforce anything. By 1985 and 1986, the crack epidemic is the dominant reality of South Central Los Angeles. The emergency rooms at Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital and USC Medical Center record it in admission patterns. The public defenders cycling through arraignment court track a specific profile: young black men, many with no prior criminal record, charged with cocaine offenses carrying mandatory minimum sentences that bear no proportion to their actual role in the supply chain. The community begs for a response from the city, from the state, from Washington. What arrives is a law enforcement surge that treats addiction as criminal behavior, fills the Los Angeles County Jail past legal capacity, and does almost nothing to address the supply chain. The supply chain is what matters. The crack reaching South Central in the early years of the epidemic does not arrive through a dozen competing networks. It arrives through a single consolidated operation, centered on a young man from the neighborhood who starts with $25 worth of product and within 3 years runs the largest crack distribution network in Los Angeles history. His name is Freeway Rick Ross. And the supply chain above him leads somewhere that law enforcement, in the early 1980s, is specifically not positioned to look. The numbers are worth pausing on before the name gets lost in the narrative. Between 1984 and 1990, the number of people in California state prisons for drug offenses triples. The incarceration rate for black men in California increases at a rate that has no precedent in the state's history. The crack-related homicide rate in South Central during the mid-1980s reaches levels that Los Angeles County emergency physicians describe in their own professional literature as a public health catastrophe equivalent to a war zone. Entire blocks of families, the homeowners, the church members, the factory workers who built the neighborhood lose children to the epidemic, not to violence but to addiction. The addiction arrives through supply lines nobody can trace. The supply lines are the story. And the story begins not in Los Angeles, but in a CIA conference room in 1981, where a decision is made about which people to use and which laws to ignore in the service of a covert war in Central America. Event 2, RICKYROSS and the Supply Chain, 1980 to 1989. It is 1982. Freeway Rick Ross is 22 years old. He grows up in South Central, drops out of Dorsey High School, and begins his career in cocaine distribution in the way that most careers begin in circumstances like his, through proximity, through opportunity, through the application of native intelligence to the most available avenue. He cannot read well. Dyslexia has followed him since childhood, making the formal educational path effectively closed. What he can do, what people who work with him in these years describe consistently, is think about logistics. He understands how to move product across a large city. He understands how to manage a workforce of people who have no legal employment relationship with him. He understands costs and margins and scale in a way that has nothing to do with formal business education and everything to do with attention and intelligence applied to the problem at hand. He has one primary supplier. He knows the man as Blandon. Danilo Blandon is a Nicaraguan exile living in the Pico Union neighborhood of Los Angeles, a former official in the agricultural ministry of Anastasio Somoza's government, the government the Sandinista Revolution overthrows in July 1979. Blandon arrives in the United States as part of the wave of Nicaraguan exiles who settle in Los Angeles after the revolution, a community organized substantially around opposition to the Sandinista government that has taken over their country. Within this community, Blandon presents himself as a Contra fundraiser. He tells people he raises money for the armed resistance. He does. He raises it through cocaine sales. Blandon introduces Ross to Norwin Menezes, who operates from the San Francisco Bay Area. Menezes is older, more established, and operating at a different scale. He appears in DEA intelligence files as a significant cocaine trafficker as early as 1979. He has access to Colombian cocaine sources at the top of the production chain. Together, Blandon and Menezes form the supply structure above Ross. They bring the cocaine. Ross moves it through South Central and eventually through a distribution network that reaches across much of the western United States. The prices Blandon offers Ross are the economic anomaly that DEA analysts later identify as the marker of something unusual. The prices are dramatically lower than what any competing supplier can offer for equivalent purity. Ross's cost advantage is so pronounced that his distribution network essentially crowds out competition in South Central. The question of how Blandon and Menezes sustain these prices, how they obtain cocaine in volume and purity at a cost that produces margins that make Ross's prices possible, is the question that leads back to the Contra program and to the CIA. The answer is that the cocaine is moving through networks that the CIA is actively supporting, and the infrastructure of the Contra program, planes, airstrips, cross-border logistics, protection from prosecution, reduces the cost of that movement in ways that show up in the price Ross pays per kilo. By Ross's own account, confirmed in multiple court proceedings, he eventually moves cocaine at a pace that generates tens of millions of dollars annually. At the peak of the operation, he is selling multiple kilos per day. He employs hundreds of people directly and supplies a distributor network that employs hundreds more. The crack epidemic in South Central between 1983 and 1987, the specific wave of the epidemic that produces the violence, the addiction rates, the community destruction that Congress eventually addresses through legislation, is substantially fueled by the product flowing through the Blandon-Menezes-Ross supply chain. The DEA becomes aware of Ross by 1984. The agency builds cases against him and they stall. The pattern of stalled investigations extends across multiple DEA efforts to move up the chain toward Blandon and Menezes. Agents who work these cases and later testify before Congress describe encountering interference that originates above the field level, not explicit orders to stop, but the accumulation of deferrals and deprioritizations that produce the same result. Cases that develop traction encounter obstacles that the agents involved do not experience as ordinary prosecutorial attrition. Ross faces federal prosecution in 1989 and receives a lengthy sentence. Blandon cooperates with the government and receives a dramatically shorter sentence. Blandon is released early and placed on the DEA payroll as a paid informant, collecting government salary from the same agency he had spent years evading. Menezes is eventually prosecuted not in the United States but in Nicaragua after a change of government there for cocaine trafficking. He is not prosecuted in the United States for the product that flows through his network into South Central Los Angeles. Ross serves more time in federal prison than either of the men above him in the supply chain. This is not a malfunction of the justice system. It is the justice system operating according to a hierarchy of priorities in which contra-connected traffickers at the top of the supply chain are assets to be protected and employed, and street-level distributors at the bottom are targets to be prosecuted under mandatory minimum law. What Ross's operation looks like at its peak is documented in court testimony and in reporting built from primary sources. At the height of the operation in the mid-1980s, Ross moves multiple kilos of cocaine per day. He develops distribution channels that extend from South Central across the Los Angeles basin and eventually to cities including Cincinnati, Cleveland, and St. Louis, markets that Ross reaches by franchising his supply advantage to distributors in other cities who cannot access Colombian cocaine at the prices Blandon charges him. The epidemic is not a series of independent local phenomena. It is a networked supply operation centered on a single point of supply that benefits from the specific cost structure that the Contra program's infrastructure makes possible. The DEA watches it develop for 5 years without being able to trace it to its source. The 1982 MOU explains why. The community of South Central serves the longest sentence of all. It is still serving it. Event 3, the Contra program, what the CIA was actually doing in Nicaragua, 1979-1988. It is July 1979. The Sandinista National Liberation Front marches into Managua and Anastasio Somoza flees to Miami, ending a family dictatorship that has ruled Nicaragua for over 4 decades with American financial support, American training for its security forces, and American diplomatic backing. The Sandinistas are a left-wing revolutionary movement aligned with Cuba, rhetorically hostile to American influence in Central America, and governing a country that the Reagan administration, taking office 18 months later, classifies as a communist beachhead that must be reversed. President Ronald Reagan signs a classified presidential finding in December 1981, authorizing the Central Intelligence Agency to organize, train, arm, fund, and support a paramilitary opposition force to pressure the Sandinista government. The CIA begins working with former members of Somoza's National Guard, men who have fled to Honduras, Costa Rica, Miami, and Los Angeles, and with Nicaraguan exile organizations in the United States to build what becomes the Contras. The program's formal objective, as stated in the presidential finding, is to pressure the Sandinistas and interdict arms flowing from Nicaragua to leftist guerrillas in El Salvador. The practical objective, which CIA Director William Casey pursues with an enthusiasm that regularly outruns the program's legal authorization, is to overthrow the Sandinista government entirely. Casey is the dominant figure in the program's early years. He is a former OSS officer, a Wall Street lawyer, a man who believes deeply in covert action as an instrument of American foreign policy, and who views congressional oversight of intelligence operations as an obstacle to be managed rather than a constitutional requirement to be respected. He runs the Contra program with this worldview, and the worldview produces consequences that eventually become visible in the form of the Iran-Contra scandal, and less visibly but more consequentially, in the cocaine that flows through Contra-connected networks into American cities. The assets the CIA employs in the Contra program are not a clean group. This is known. Covert operations are not run by saints, and the available pool of Nicaraguan exile personnel with the motivation, the connections, and the physical courage to participate in an armed opposition to the Sandinistas includes a significant number of former Somoza National Guard officers whose human rights records the CIA is not in a position to review carefully before the program requires them. It also includes, in multiple documented cases, individuals involved in the cocaine trade that is flowing through Central America in large quantities during this period. The cocaine geography of Central America in the early 1980s is important. The Colombian cartels, the Medellin organization under Pablo Escobar, and the Cali cartel under the Rodriguez Orjuela brothers are at the peak of their power. They are shipping cocaine north through Central America in volumes that dwarf anything the American market has seen before. The route through Central America requires infrastructure, landing strips in remote areas, ground transportation, people with connections who can smooth out problems with local authorities, and organizational cover for the movement of large amounts of product. The Contra networks, with their planes and airstrips and cross-border logistics and their political protection from the American government, provide exactly this infrastructure. The overlap is not coincidental. It is functionally irresistible. Multiple people within the CIA and the DEA document this overlap. Pilots who fly Contra supply missions carry cocaine on return trips. Nicaraguan exile figures with documented CIA connections are simultaneously identified in DEA trafficking intelligence. Celerino Castillo III, a DEA agent stationed at the American Embassy in El Salvador, watches Contra supply flights operating out of Ilopango Air Base and documents aircraft carrying cocaine on return trips to the United States. He logs tail numbers and dates and flight patterns. He files reports through official DEA channels. He receives no meaningful response. He later writes a book, Powder Burns, published in 1994, describing what he witnesses. He testifies before Congress multiple times. His contemporaneous documentation sits in DEA files. One of the pilots operating through Ilopango during this period is a man named Barry Seal, who by the mid-1980s is the most significant cocaine smuggler in American history by volume. Seal eventually cooperates with the DEA and becomes a government informant. Before his assassination in Baton Rouge in February 1986, shot by Colombian cartel gunmen while on probation, Seal provides the DEA with extensive information about cocaine trafficking through the Contra logistics network, including the use of airstrips and aircraft operating under the protection of the Contra program. Seal's testimony and cooperation records are in government files. The DEA knows what Seal describes. The CIA knows what Seal describes. The 1982 MOU ensures that the CIA has no legal obligation to share what it knows with the DEA. Congress responds to the scope of the Contra program with the Boland Amendments, a series of increasingly restrictive provisions attached to intelligence appropriations bills between 1982 and 1984, eventually prohibiting direct CIA funding for operations intended to overthrow the Sandinista government. The restrictions produce Iran-Contra, Oliver North's parallel funding structure, the arms sales to Iran, the diversion of proceeds to the Contras, the shredding of documents in North's NSC office. The Tower Commission and the Congressional Iran-Contra investigation document this extensively. Iran-Contra becomes the visible scandal, the drug trafficking dimension running parallel to it, overlapping with it, constituting a separate ongoing violation of federal law that the Iran-Contra investigation barely touches, remains below the public surface. Senator John Kerry tries to bring it above the surface. His effort produces a 144-page Senate report in 1989 that the political system absorbs without consequence. Gary Webb tries again in 1996 with primary sources and court documents. The response to his attempt is what this video is primarily documenting, but the Contra program is where the supply chain starts. Without the program, the network has a different shape and a different cost structure, and the economics that allow Blandon to supply Ross at prices no competitor can match do not work the way they work. The Iran-Contra investigation's failure to fully examine the drug trafficking dimension has a specific explanation. The investigation is run by a select committee under the constraints of congressional politics. The Republicans on the committee are protecting the Reagan administration's legacy. The Democrats on the committee are focused on the constitutional questions, the circumvention of the Boland Amendment, the diversion of Iranian arms proceeds, the creation of a parallel NSA-supervised foreign policy operation outside normal governmental channels. The drug trafficking connection is the story that requires sustained investigative attention that the committee's political dynamics will not sustain. The Kerry subcommittee is the exception. It focuses specifically on the drug connection, and the Kerry subcommittee's findings are what the political system absorbs without consequence in 1989. The Contra program is also where the supply chain of the crack epidemic starts. That connection the Iran-Contra investigation barely touches. Gary Webb touches it, and that is why everything that happens to Gary Webb happens. Event 4, the 1982 Memorandum, the legal architecture of looking away, 1982. It is the winter of 1982. The Contra program is barely a year old. CIA Director William Casey and his legal team are constructing the covert infrastructure that will sustain the Nicaraguan resistance operation, the funding channels, the supply networks, the personnel, the deniability architecture that allows the Reagan administration to maintain publicly that it is not running a covert war in Central America, while it is running a covert war in Central America. They are also managing a specific legal problem. Someone in the intelligence community's legal apparatus understands what is coming. The Contra networks being assembled include individuals whose activities extend beyond the authorized mission. Some of these individuals traffic drugs. CIA case officers in the field know this in some instances, suspect it in others, and operate in an environment where the primary institutional imperative is keeping the Contra program funded and functional. The mission is the mission. The drug trafficking is a secondary concern. But the law does not treat it as secondary. Under the National Security Act and related federal statutes, when a federal agency, any federal agency, including the Central Intelligence Agency, has reason to believe that a federal crime has been committed in connection with agency activities, the agency has a legal obligation to report that information to the Department of Justice. The obligation is not discretionary. It does not contain a national security exception. It applies to drug trafficking with the same force it applies to any other federal crime. If CIA officers know their Contra assets are trafficking cocaine, they are legally required to report what they know to the DOJ. In February 1982, CIA Director William Casey and Attorney General William French Smith sign a Memorandum of Understanding. The document is classified at the time of its signing. It surfaces years later through a Freedom of Information Act request and is subsequently confirmed and discussed in the CIA Inspector General's 1998 report. The memo establishes that the CIA is not legally required to report narcotics trafficking information to the Department of Justice when the trafficking involves CIA assets, agents, or contractors. This sentence needs to be read carefully. The CIA is not legally required to report narcotics trafficking to the Department of Justice when the traffickers are CIA assets. The Director of Central Intelligence and the Attorney General of the United States agree, in writing, that the law's requirement to report federal crimes does not apply to the CIA when the federal crimes are committed by its own people. The defenders of the memo, and there are defenders who emerge when the document becomes public, argue that it is standard jurisdictional clarification, not an authorization for drug trafficking. They are technically correct that it does not authorize trafficking, but the effect of the memo is not technical, the effect is practical. When a CIA case officer in Central America has information that a Contra-connected figure is moving cocaine into the United States, the 1982 MOU tells that officer that there is no legal mechanism requiring him to report it to anyone. The operational imperative to keep the Contra network functional fills the space that the legal requirement has been removed from. The officer does not report it. The trafficking continues. The cocaine flows toward Los Angeles. The legal architecture of looking away is what makes everything else in this story possible. Without the 1982 MOU, CIA officers who know about Contra drug trafficking face a legal obligation to report it. With the MOU, they face no such obligation, and the institutional culture of protecting covert programs from law enforcement scrutiny fills the gap. The memo transforms what would otherwise be a violation of federal law into institutional policy. The practical effect of this transformation shows up in the DEA's files. In 1984 and 1985 and 1986, when DEA field officers are running cases against the Blandón-Meneses network and hitting obstacles, the 1982 MOU operates as the institutional background to those obstacles. Case officers at the CIA who receive field intelligence about Contra-connected trafficking do not report it to the DEA or to the DOJ. They have a signed legal document establishing that they are not required to. The DEA agents who work the cases against Blandón and Meneses are operating without the intelligence that the CIA holds. The CIA holds it under the protection of the memo. The separate institutional streams, law enforcement pursuing the trafficking from the street up, intelligence holding information about the trafficking from the program down, never converge. The memo is the reason they never converge. A signed agreement between the CIA director and the Attorney General of the United States ensures that the left hand of the American government never has to know what the right hand is doing, even when the right hand is doing something that kills thousands of Americans. William French Smith signs the memo as Attorney General in February 1982. He dies in October 1990. He is never charged with anything in connection with the memo or its effects. William Casey signs it as CIA Director. He suffers a seizure at CIA headquarters in December 1986 at the height of the Iran-Contra investigation and dies in May 1987 before he can be compelled to testify about the Contra program's full scope. The two men who create the legal architecture of looking away die before the full consequences of that creation become visible to the public. The memo is in the National Archives. The FOIA request that surfaces it is in the public record. The CIA Inspector General's 1998 report discusses it specifically. You can read it. Nobody who signs it is ever charged with anything. Event 5, Blandón and Meneses, The Traffickers at the Center, 1981-1996. It is 1981. Danilo Blandón is 31 years old. He holds a graduate degree in marketing from a Central American university. He has worked as an agricultural ministry official under Somoza. He arrives in Los Angeles after the revolution as part of the wave of Nicaraguan exiles who settle in the Pico Union neighborhood and organize around the Contra cause. He is educated, articulate, politically committed, and by his own sworn testimony, given years later in multiple federal proceedings, he begins selling cocaine in the United States to raise money for the armed resistance. Blandón's testimony is the evidentiary core on which Gary Webb's reporting rests and on which the CIA Inspector General's investigation builds. It is not Webb's inference or interpretation. It is what Blandón says under oath. He testifies in the federal prosecution of Ricky Ross in San Diego. He testifies in his own legal proceedings. He testifies before congressional investigators. In each of these forums under oath, he describes the same thing. He sells cocaine, the money goes to the Contra cause, his supply connection is Norwin Meneses, his primary American customer is Ricky Ross. Blandón describes meeting with Contra leaders in the early 1980s and explaining that he is raising funds through cocaine sales. He describes the arrangement as understood and accepted by the leadership of the Contra organizations he deals with. He describes the Contra connection not as peripheral to his trafficking, but as its stated purpose and organizational framework. He is not describing this as a rogue operation. He is describing it as a mission. The specific detail in Blandon's testimony that becomes central to Webb's reporting and to the subsequent controversy is a statement Blandon makes about what happened to the cocaine proceeds. Blandon testifies that the money, or a significant portion of it, went to the FDN, the Fuerza Democrática Nicaraguense, the primary Contra organization that the CIA is building and funding. The CIA is funding the same organization that Blandon testifies is receiving cocaine proceeds. This convergence is what makes the story a CIA story rather than simply a drug trafficking story. Norwin Menezes operates at a higher level. He has been in DEA intelligence files as a significant cocaine trafficker since 1979, before the Contra program exists and before the crack epidemic begins. His network has Colombian sources, connections to the Medellin cartel supply chain that gives him access to cocaine in quantities and at prices that smaller operations cannot match. In the early 1980s, Menezes is known enough within the DEA's trafficking intelligence to be a subject of at least 13 separate investigations over the course of the decade. He is not prosecuted in the United States during this period. The 13 investigations stall. The specific mechanisms by which they stall vary: witnesses who become unavailable, cases that are deprioritized, prosecutions that are deferred at the request of another agency. But the pattern across 13 separate investigative efforts is consistent enough that DEA agents who work them later testify to the Kerry Committee about the pattern with specificity. Celerino Castillo, the DEA agent in El Salvador, documents the operational reality of what Menezes and the Contra-connected trafficking networks look like from the field. From his post at the American Embassy in San Salvador, Castillo watches aircraft operating through Ilopango Air Base, aircraft that carry Contra supply cargo on southbound flights and on documented return flights to the United States carry cocaine. He logs the tail numbers. He files reports. He gets no response that leads to action. He eventually leaves the DEA and publishes his account. His contemporaneous documentation is what the CIA Inspector General's investigation later confirms existed: agency knowledge of drug trafficking by Contra-connected networks, documented in DEA files and CIA reports, not passed to law enforcement. The accounting for Blandon and Menezes is the accounting that Ricky Ross experiences from the inside. He serves the longest sentence of anyone in the supply chain. Blandon cooperates, is released early, goes on the DEA payroll. Menezes is prosecuted in Nicaragua, not in the United States, for a fraction of what the documented evidence of his American trafficking would warrant. The men above Ross in the chain serve less time and face less legal consequence than the man below them. What Blandon's DEA employment represents, beyond the irony of it, is the institutional logic of the American drug war as it operates in documented practice. The purpose of a confidential informant program is to trade information about higher-level traffickers for leniency toward lower-level ones. The logic works when the informant provides information that leads to prosecutions above them. In Blandon's case, the information he provides leads to Ricky Ross, the man below him in the chain. The man above Blandon in the chain, the CIA's Contra program, is not a subject that the DEA's informant program can usefully pursue. So the DEA employs the man at the top of the accessible portion of the supply chain and uses him to prosecute the man below him, who is already in prison, in a sting operation that results in a second federal conviction for Ross before his first sentence is even fully served. The system produces a result: Ross serves more time, Blandon collects a salary that is the precise inverse of any rational accountability structure. The man whose cocaine supply chain fuels the crack epidemic in south-central Los Angeles is on the government payroll. The man who distributes it is in federal prison. The community it destroys is still destroyed. Event 6, the DEA agents who tried and were blocked, 1980 to 1992. Is 1984. DEA agents working the Los Angeles field office are aware of Ricky Ross. They are tracking the downstream effects of his operation in South Central, the volume of crack cocaine reaching the street, the prices, the geographic spread of the distribution network. The economic anomalies in Ross's operation, the unusually low prices, the consistently high purity, the speed with which the supply chain can replenish itself, are markers of something unusual at the supply level. The agents who notice these anomalies try to trace them upward through Blandon and Menezes. The cases stall. The specific mechanisms vary by case and by year, but the pattern is consistent across the multiple DEA investigative efforts that developed during the 1980s and that involved the Blandon-Menezes network. DEA agent Robert Neves, who works Central American operations during this period and later becomes the DEA's Chief of International Operations, describes the institutional dynamic in retrospective interviews. There is a hierarchy of national security priorities, he explains, and when a drug investigation conflicts with a covert program operating under that hierarchy, the drug investigation loses. This loss does not necessarily happen through an explicit order to stand down. It happens through the accumulation of bureaucratic obstacles that produce, over time, the same result. Celerino Castillo's experience in El Salvador is the clearest documented instance of a DEA agent watching Contra drug trafficking from field position and getting no response from his reporting. Castillo is stationed at the American Embassy in San Salvador from 1985 to 1991. From this position, he observes Contra supply flights operating out of Ilopango Air Base, which functions as a major logistics hub for the CIA's Contra support operation. Castillo documents specific flights, tail numbers, dates, times, cargo manifests that do not match what the aircraft are actually carrying, and files his observations through official DEA cables and operational reports. Among the flights he documents are aircraft that carry cocaine on return trips to the United States. He reports this through official channels. He gets no meaningful response. Castillo later describes encountering Oliver North's network operating through Ilopango. He describes being told, in terms he characterizes as unmistakable, that the operations he is witnessing are not his concern. He describes the specific experience of being a federal law enforcement agent watching federal crimes being committed and being told that the federal crimes are someone else's problem. He leaves the DEA eventually and writes Powderburns, his memoir of what he witnesses. He testifies before Congress. His account does not change over years of public discussion of it. Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts opens his subcommittee investigation in 1986 specifically to provide a forum for what DEA agents in the field have been unable to get action on through official channels. Kerry is a Vietnam veteran and freshman senator who understands from personal experience what governments do in the name of national security and why the claim of national security can become a mechanism for avoiding accountability. His chief investigator, Jack Blum, is a meticulous lawyer who spends 3 years building the evidentiary record from DEA agents' testimony, State Department cables, classified intelligence documents, and interviews with participants in the Contra drug networks. The agents who testify before the Kerry subcommittee describe specific cases. They describe prosecutions that are ready to move and that encounter deferrals requested by other agencies. They describe witnesses who become unavailable at moments that coincide with the development of Contra connections in the investigation. They describe the specific experience of watching cases that should produce indictments produce nothing instead. The testimony is not vague or impressionistic. It names specific cases, specific years, specific individuals, and specific interference. The interference does not always look like an explicit order. It looks like what happens when an investigative agency operates in an environment where certain subjects are understood to be protected, and the protection does not need to be stated explicitly because everyone in the relevant institutions already understands it. The Kerry Committee documents this testimony in its 144-page report, formally published in April 1989. The report finds that Contra-connected organizations received payments from drug traffickers, that elements of the United States government were aware of this and failed to act, and that DEA investigations that developed traction against Contra-connected networks encountered interference from above the field level. These findings are based on sworn testimony. They are in the Senate record. They are still there. The accounting for the agents who tried, they are not fired, not disciplined, not silenced by explicit order. They are simply not listened to. Castillo leaves the DEA frustrated and writes his book. Others retire. Some continue their careers in law enforcement. None of them see the accountability for what they document that the evidence they provide warrants. Celerino Castillo's specific experience deserves the detail it is usually denied. From his post at the American Embassy in San Salvador, Castillo becomes aware that aircraft operating under the Contra supply umbrella are using Ilopango Air Base in ways that go beyond the authorized mission. He begins logging what he sees. He is a DEA agent. Logging drug-related activity is his job. He files reports. His supervisor at the DEA's El Salvador post acknowledges the reports. The reports go into the system. Nothing follows from them. Castillo is told, in terms he later describes as unmistakable, that the operations at Ilopango involving the Contra-connected aircraft are not his concern. He is a DEA agent being told that documented drug activity is not his concern because the people doing it have a different set of institutional sponsors. That is the 1982 MOU operating in the field. Not as a legal document that anyone quotes to Castillo, as an institutional culture that he experiences as closed doors and silence whenever he follows a lead toward the Contra network. He leaves the DEA eventually, writes powder burns, testifies before Congress. His account does not change. The documentation he produces is what the CIA IG confirms existed. Jack Blum's frustration with the aftermath of the Kerry Committee is the frustration of a man who builds a case that goes nowhere. When Gary Webb calls him in 1995, Blum tells him he is on the right track. He tells him to keep going. That is the crack through which the documented truth eventually surfaces, not an official investigation that produces prosecutions, but a reporter who reads the Kerry report and understands what it means and calls the investigator who built it. Event 7, Gary Webb and the Dark Alliance Investigation, 1995-1996. It is 1995. Gary Webb is 40 years old and staff reporter at the San Jose Mercury News, a well-resourced regional newspaper with a record of serious investigative work. Webb has been a journalist since his early 20s, working his way up through small papers in Kentucky and Ohio before arriving in California. He is not flashy. He is methodical. He builds cases from documents rather than from anonymous sources. He understands court records and government files in the way that a litigator understands evidence, as a structure that either holds or doesn't, and that he is not going to present as holding until he has tested it from every angle he can find. His 1990 Pulitzer participation comes through the Mercury News team that covers the Loma Prieta earthquake. His 1994 series on California Highway Patrol seizure abuse, documenting how the CHP uses asset seizure laws to confiscate property from innocent drivers on Interstate 8, is the kind of journalism that produces real consequences: legislative hearings, policy changes, refunded property. He knows how to do this work. The tip that starts the Dark Alliance investigation comes from Coral Baca, the girlfriend of a San Jose man named Rafael Cornillo, who has been arrested in a federal cocaine case. Baca tells Webb that the prosecution connects to a Nicaraguan trafficker named Ricky Ross, and that Ross's supply chain has connections to the Nicaraguan Contras. Webb begins pulling the court files from Ross's San Diego federal prosecution. What he finds in those court files is Blandon's testimony. Blandon testifies under oath in multiple sessions during Ross's prosecution about his Contra connections and his cocaine sales. The testimony is in the public court record. It is available to anyone who pulls the transcripts. Webb reads it. He understands what he is reading. He begins building outward from the testimony, pulling DEA documents through public records requests, reading the Kerry Committee report, calling Jack Blum, filing FOIA requests for intelligence documents. The investigation takes approximately a year. Webb travels to Nicaragua and interviews Menezes in the Nicaraguan prison where he is serving time on Nicaraguan drug charges. Menezes is forthcoming in ways that some sources are not. He has already been convicted. He has nothing left to protect in the United States, and he is apparently willing to talk about what he did and why in terms that confirm the core of what Blandon's court testimony documents. Webb interviews Ricky Ross extensively. Ross's account of his relationship with Blandon, of the prices Blandon charges, of the volume of cocaine that flows through the supply chain, confirms the scale of what Webb is documenting from the court records. Webb's methodology is documented and verifiable. He tells readers precisely which court record or government file each specific claim comes from. The Mercury News makes many of the underlying documents available on its website alongside the published series, a practice that in 1996 is unusual enough to be almost unprecedented for a newspaper investigation of this scope. Anyone who disputes Webb's claims has access to the documents he cites and can check whether his account of what they say is accurate. Dark Alliance publishes in the San Jose Mercury News on August 18, 1996. The series runs 3 days. The Mercury News simultaneously publishes it on its website, which in 1996 is new enough that the practice reaches communities the print edition would not reach on its own. The series circulates through the early internet, through black community radio stations, through civil rights organizations, through the networks of people in South Central Los Angeles and communities like it who have believed for years that the crack epidemic is not simply a natural disaster, and who now have documented primary sources to point to. The response in the black community has a specific character that the mainstream press coverage of the controversy consistently fails to capture. Dark Alliance does not reveal something unknown to residents of South Central Los Angeles. It confirms something that many of them have believed, or known in the way that communities know things that the institutional record refuses to validate for 15 years. The conspiracy theory that the government put crack in the neighborhood is older than Gary Webb's reporting. What Dark Alliance provides is not the theory. It is the primary source documentation for what the theory has always been describing. For people in South Central who have watched their neighborhood destroyed and their children imprisoned while the supply chain remained invisible and untouchable, the reaction to Webb's series is not, "I can't believe this," it is, "I always knew. The documents just arrived." Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who represents South Central and has been raising questions about Contra drug connections for years without sustained press attention, demands a federal investigation. The CIA, the DOJ, and other agencies issue official responses. And then the 3 most powerful newspapers in the country arrive, not to investigate the story, but to attack the reporter who found it. Event 8, the CIA's Media War, How the Press Became a Cover-Up Tool, 1996-1997. It is September 1996, 3 weeks after Dark Alliance publishes. The Washington Post runs a piece on the controversy. Not on the CIA and the Contras and the cocaine supply chain, on Gary Webb. The piece focuses on what the Post characterizes as overstatements and unsupported implications in Webb's reporting. It frames the story as a case of a regional newspaper overselling an incomplete investigation. It treats the documented facts in Webb's series, Blandon's sworn testimony about Contra connections, Meaney's DEA file history, the 1982 memo, the Kerry Committee's findings, as secondary to the methodological questions it raises. The New York Times and the Los Angeles Times follow within weeks, each publishing substantial pieces in the same register. Webb's methodology is flawed, his implications are unsupported, his story is less than it appears. The coordination between these pieces and the CIA is documented, not alleged. Documented in the CIA's own Inspector General's preliminary findings, issued in 1997 and discussed in subsequent reporting by journalists including Robert Perry, who has covered the CIA Contra story since the 1980s. CIA public affairs officials provide information and framing to journalists working on pieces critical of Webb's series. Mark Mansfield, who heads the CIA's public affairs office during this period, coordinates an effort to shape the national press narrative about Dark Alliance in ways that serve the agency's interests. The agency that is the subject of the investigation helps write the coverage that disputes the investigation. This is what Operation Mockingbird looks like when it operates in 1996 instead of 1954. The Church Committee investigation in the mid-1970s partially exposes the CIA's historical practice of cultivating relationships with American journalists who provide favorable coverage and suppress unfavorable stories. The practice does not end with the Church Committee. It continues in the more sophisticated form that institutional relationships take when they cannot be explicit. The background briefings, the sourcing that favors certain framings, the willingness of reporters on a national security beat to accept an agency's characterization of a regional paper's methodology rather than independently investigating the underlying story. The critical pieces at the three major papers have something specific in common. They attack Webb's methodology without independently investigating his documented facts. The question that a rigorous editorial response to Dark Alliance would demand is, are Blandon's sworn statements about his Contra connections documented in court records? Are Menes's DEA file appearances documented? Does the 1982 CIA-DOJ Memorandum of Understanding exist and say what Webb claims it says? Does the Kerry Committee report say what Webb claims it says? These questions have answers. They are answerable by pulling the documents. None of the major paper pieces pull the documents. They accept the CIA's characterization of Webb's methodology and present that characterization as the authoritative response to his reporting. The Mercury News's institutional response to the pressure is the key domestic failure in this story. The paper's executive editor, Jerry Seppos, conducts an internal review of Webb's reporting. The review does not find fabrication. It does not find that Webb's core documented claims, Blandon's Contra connections established through sworn court testimony, the 1982 memo, the DEA's blocked prosecutions, the Kerry Committee's findings, are wrong. It finds that some of Webb's implications are overstated relative to what the evidence strictly establishes. In May 1997, Seppos publishes an editor's note that does not retract Dark Alliance but expresses regret about aspects of its presentation. The note is treated by the CIA's defenders and by the journalists who attacked Webb as a full vindication of their criticism. It is used to characterize the Mercury News itself as having backed away from the story. Webb, within the professional logic of American newspaper journalism, is now associated with a story his own paper has partially disowned. He is transferred from the investigative unit to the suburban Cupertino bureau, a posting that is, within the culture of American newspaper journalism, an unmistakable message about his standing in the organization. He resigns in December 1997. The journalists who write the critical pieces continue their careers. The editors who approve those pieces continue their careers. The CIA officials who coordinate the press campaign against Webb face no professional consequence. The documented story of CIA knowledge of Contra drug trafficking, the story that Webb's reporting brings to public attention, and that the CIA's own Inspector General will confirm 2 years later, is, by late 1997, treated in the mainstream press as a discredited investigation by a discredited reporter. Webb is 42 years old. He has documented the most significant CIA scandal since Iran-Contra. He is unemployable at the major newspapers. He is right about everything that matters, and the institutional machinery that should validate that rightness has instead used it to destroy him. The reporters at the Times and the Post who write the critical pieces are not villains in the simple sense. They are working in a system where access to intelligence agencies depends on maintaining relationships with those agencies, where a regional newspaper that has found something big is a professional challenge as much as a story to investigate, and where the CIA's Public Affairs Office is an available and often reliable source that has never before been caught on record coordinating a press campaign to destroy a reporter. They make the mistake that journalists operating on deadlines within institutions make. They take the available framing from the most credible seeming source, the agency with the classification authority in the historical record, and apply it to a story they did not build themselves. The CIA's Public Affairs Office is that source. The critical pieces reflect that sourcing in ways that are only fully visible after the IG documents the coordination. By then, the pieces have done their work. Webb has lost his position. The story has been labeled discredited in the institutional shorthand that shapes editorial decisions for years afterward. The CIA's media operation in 1996 and 1997 is not the last time an intelligence agency shapes press coverage of its own conduct. It is one of the most completely documented instances of it. The IG's confirmation of the coordination is part of the record. It sits alongside Webb's reporting, alongside the Kerry Committee report, alongside the 1998 IG report on Contra drug trafficking. All of it is in the public record. All of it describes the same institutional reality from different angles. None of it produces the accountability that the documented facts warrant. Event 9, the Kerry Committee, what the Senate already knew in 1989. 1986–1989. 7 years before Dark Alliance, the evidence is already there. Senator John Kerry begins his investigation in 1986. He is a freshman Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a Vietnam veteran who volunteered for combat duty after watching the Johnson administration lie about the war, and who carries from that experience an understanding of what governments do in the name of national security that his colleagues who did not serve do not necessarily share. He is not naive about the Contra program or about the CIA. He knows that covert programs involve unsavory people and morally complicated choices. What he cannot accept is the specific documented allegation that DEA agents and other law enforcement personnel have been unable to act on, that the Contra drug trafficking is not peripheral to the program but structural to it, and that elements of the American government know this and have chosen to protect the program at the expense of law enforcement. His chief investigator, Jack Blum, is a meticulous lawyer who has worked congressional investigations before and understands how to build an evidentiary record from disparate sources. Blum and the committee staff spend 3 years interviewing hundreds of witnesses and reviewing thousands of documents. They interview DEA agents, drug pilots, Contra figures, State Department officials, Justice Department officials, and participants in the cocaine networks that flow through Central America. They review classified intelligence assessments and field reporting cables. They obtain records from multiple federal agencies through the committee's oversight authority. The specific finding about the State Department's Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Office is among the most concrete documented in the Kerry report. The Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Office, NHAO, is a State Department program created to provide non-lethal aid to the Contras while nominally complying with the Boland Amendment restrictions on CIA funding. The program operates through contracted aircraft and pilots who fly supply missions from the United States to Contra camps in Honduras and Costa Rica. The Kerry Committee investigation documents that specific pilots operating under NHAO contracts also fly cocaine on return trips to the United States. One of these pilots is Wallace Blum, who testifies before the committee about his flight activities. Another is Michael Tolliver, who tells investigators that he flies 25,000 pounds of marijuana to the United States in a single shipment and receives payment for the flight through the same account structure that pays his NHAO contract flights. These are not anonymous sources. They are named individuals describing specific flights with specific cargo and specific payment mechanisms. The Kerry report includes this documentation. It is in the Senate archives. It has been there since 1989. The Kerry report finds, in language that is careful but unmistakable, individuals who were key operational figures in the Contra movement received assistance from drug traffickers. Specific Contra organizations knowingly received payments from drug proceeds. Elements of the United States government had information about these connections and failed to act on them. And certain DEA investigations that developed toward Contra-connected figures encountered interference from above the field level. The report is released in April 1989. Press coverage is modest, a news cycle or two, brief summaries in the major papers, no sustained investigative follow-up. The Reagan administration is gone. George H.W. Bush is 3 months into his presidency. The political moment for Contra accountability has passed. The Iran-Contra scandal has been processed as a story about Oliver North and the arms for hostages deal. The drug trafficking dimension has not broken through as an independent story. The Kerry report is absorbed as a postscript to Iran-Contra rather than as the independent scandal that its documented findings establish. The Senate's formal response to the Kerry report is what senatorial non-response looks like. The report is received, acknowledged in the congressional record, and referred to no committee for follow-up action. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, on which Kerry sits, takes no action to convene hearings specifically on the Kerry report's findings. The Senate Intelligence Committee, which has oversight of the CIA and would be the appropriate body to examine the agency's role in the drug trafficking documented in the report, takes no action. The Judiciary Committee, which oversees the Department of Justice and could examine why the prosecutorial decisions documented in the Kerry report are made, takes no action. The report sits in the congressional record where any senator can cite it and none do with sufficient force to produce an institutional response. Kerry himself, having spent 3 years on the investigation, moves on to other legislative priorities. He has the report. He does not have the votes to force a follow-up that the administration does not want. Jack Blum's retrospective assessment of why the Kerry report produces no prosecutions is direct. The Department of Justice under Reagan and Bush makes a prosecutorial choice, informed by the same hierarchy of priorities that produces the blocked DEA investigations in the field, not to pursue the cases that the Kerry Committee evidence would support. The 1982 MOU provides the legal framework for this choice. The CIA's institutional interest in the Contra program provides the political context. The DOJ official decision is made by political appointees who regard the Contra program as a legitimate national security priority and who regard prosecutions that might compromise Contra-connected networks as contrary to that priority. When Gary Webb calls Blum in 1995, Blum tells him he is on the right track. Blum knows the evidence. He has spent 3 years living inside it. He knows that what Webb is finding in the Blandon court records and the DEA documents is the same thing the Kerry Committee finds in its classified review, the difference being that Webb's primary source material is in the public record and can be published without classification problems. The Kerry report is the skeleton. Webb's reporting is the flesh built around it. Together they describe the same documented reality. The political system absorbs the skeleton in 1989 without consequence. The institutional apparatus of American journalism tries to discard the flesh in 1996 and 1997. The CIA's own Inspector General has to confirm both before the story can be called confirmed. The political cost of Senator Kerry's investigation deserves acknowledgement. In 1988, while his subcommittee is still conducting its investigation, Kerry runs for re-election in Massachusetts and faces attacks from Republicans who characterize his Contra drug investigation as an effort to undermine American national security for partisan gain. He wins re-election but carries the investigation's political weight into every subsequent campaign and every subsequent policy debate involving the CIA and Central America. The charge that he is soft on communism for investigating a CIA program is not a charge that dies with the investigation. It follows him. He continues his Senate career and eventually runs for president in 2004. The Contra drug investigation is rarely a focus of coverage of his career. The Kerry report is rarely cited in profiles of his Senate tenure. The most consequential investigative work of his Senate career, the work that accurately documents and confirms what the CIA Inspector General later validates, is the least visible part of the public record of his public service. This is what it costs to be right about something the institutional apparatus does not want to acknowledge. Jack Blum's account of why the Kerry report produces no prosecutions is the most direct assessment available from someone inside the investigation. Blum describes watching the Justice Department under Reagan and then Bush make prosecutorial decisions that decline to pursue cases the Kerry Committee evidence supports. He describes this not as prosecutorial discretion in the ordinary sense, the kind of judgment that produces different outcomes based on the strength of evidence, but as prosecutorial decisions that serve institutional priorities rather than legal ones. The priority is protecting the Contra program from the accountability that drug trafficking prosecutions would bring. The 1982 MOU provides the legal cover. The prosecutorial decisions provide the operational result. The Kerry Committee documents both, and the documentation goes into the Senate archive, and 7 years later Gary Webb reads it and understands that it is the skeleton of the story he is about to put flesh on. Webb calls Blum. Blum tells him to keep going. That is the moment the documentation begins its long journey toward the public record that this video draws from. Event 10, the 1998 CIA Inspector General Report, confirmed and buried, 1998. It is January 29, 1998. CIA Inspector General Frederick Hitz appears before the House Intelligence Committee. He has spent more than a year conducting the investigation that the public pressure from Dark Alliance and the Kerry report together make impossible to avoid. He is a career CIA officer, not a critic of the agency, not an outsider appointed to cause trouble, but someone who has served the agency for decades and who now must report what his investigation has found. He tells the committee that the CIA did not meet its legal obligations during the 1980s with respect to drug trafficking by Contra-connected individuals and organizations. He tells the committee that CIA officials had information about drug trafficking by individuals connected to the Contra networks and did not report it to law enforcement as legally required. He confirms the existence and effect of the 1982 CIA-DOJ Memorandum of Understanding. He does not use the word conspiracy. He does not allege that CIA headquarters ordered anyone to import cocaine. He presents in the careful language of an inspector general who understands the weight of what he is confirming, the findings that his investigation has produced. Congresswoman Maxine Waters is in the hearing room. She asks Hitz whether what he is describing means that the CIA knew its assets were trafficking cocaine and did not tell law enforcement. Hitz confirms in the specific legal terms the question requires that this is what his investigation finds. The exchange is in the congressional record. The full IG report, officially the CIA Inspector General's report on alleged connections between the CIA and the Contras in cocaine trafficking to the United States, takes several more months to complete. When it is finalized, it runs to more than 400 pages. It is classified in full. A redacted public version is prepared over the following months. The public version is released on Thursday, October 8, 1998. The following Monday is Columbus Day, a federal holiday. Between a Thursday afternoon document release and a Monday holiday, the American news cycle has approximately 18 hours of active operation. This is the shortest viable news window available in the American press calendar. The choice of this specific release date is not documented in any public record as a deliberate strategy. The effect is documented in the coverage that follows: one news cycle on Friday, October 9, and then the holiday weekend absorbs it. The report finds CIA officials had specific information about drug trafficking by Contra-connected individuals and organizations during the 1980s and failed to report it to law enforcement as legally required. The 1982 MOU provided the legal framework within which this failure operates. The report identifies specific instances, some named and some redacted, where CIA officers had trafficking information about their assets and did not act on it. The report also finds that when the CIA's own Office of Inspector General conducted an earlier internal review in 1994 in response to the Kerry Committee's findings, that review was narrow in scope and did not fully examine what the agency knew. This is the CIA's own Inspector General finding that the CIA's own Inspector General did not do its job the first time. It is the institution investigating its failure to investigate its failure. Frederick Hitz retires from the CIA after completing the investigation. He subsequently teaches law at Princeton and Yale. He is not disciplined. The CIA officers whose specific failures to report drug trafficking by Contra assets are documented in his report face no professional consequences. The report does not name them publicly. It documents the institutional failure and describes the institutional decisions without identifying the specific decision makers who face no accountability. Gary Webb is working at the California legislature when the Hitz report drops, making a government analyst's salary after losing his journalism career. He writes a piece noting that the CIA's own Inspector General has confirmed what he reports in 1996. No major newspaper publishes the piece. The reporters at the Times and the Post who write the 1996 and 1997 pieces attacking his methodology do not write follow-up pieces acknowledging that the methodology produces correct findings. The editors who publish those critical pieces do not publish corrections. The IG report receives its one day of coverage on October 9, 1998, and disappears. The deliberate nature of the October 8 release date is worth sitting with because it is the most concrete documented instance in this entire story of institutional information management at work. The CIA does not suppress the report. Suppression would be legally and politically untenable by 1998. Congress has demanded the investigation. House Intelligence Committee members have been briefed on its findings. and the preliminary hits testimony has already placed the essential conclusion in the public record. What the CIA does instead is choose the release format and timing with precision. A classified report declassified into a redacted public version, released on the Thursday before a 3-day weekend, in October of a midterm election year when every major newspaper and television network has finite editorial bandwidth. The story runs on Friday. The holiday absorbs it. By Tuesday, the news cycle has moved to other things, and the 400-page document that confirms Gary Webb is right sits in the National Archives waiting for the journalists who will never come. Frederick Hitz retires from the CIA in 1998 after completing the investigation. He teaches law at Princeton and then Yale. He gives occasional interviews about the investigation in later years. He is not disciplined. He is not celebrated. He produced the most significant self-critical intelligence community document since the Church Committee's investigation in the mid-1970s, and it is released on a Thursday before Columbus Day, and that is the last anyone officially talks about it. Webb is right. The documents say he is right. The CIA says it officially in a 400-page report released on a Thursday before a holiday. Nobody acts on it. Nobody who participated in his destruction acknowledges it. Nobody is charged with anything. The cover-up is complete enough that the confirmation of the underlying story produces no sequel. Event 11, Webb's destruction and the 2 gunshot wounds, 1997-2004. It is the fall of 2004. Gary Webb is 49 years old. He has been out of daily journalism for 7 years. He is living in a rented house in Carmichael, a suburb of Sacramento, after losing his house in Rancho Murrieta to foreclosure. He cannot make the mortgage payments on a government analyst's salary. His second book, a collection of investigative journalism pieces called The Killing Game, has sold modestly. His marriage to Sue Bell, his partner since his 20s, has ended. His children are grown. He applies for reporting positions at newspapers across California. He gets interviews at some papers. He is not hired. The Dark Alliance controversy follows his resume. The specific mechanics of the career destruction are worth documenting, because they are the mechanics of how institutional power manages a journalist who finds something it does not want found. Webb is not fired. He is transferred from the Mercury News's investigative unit to the Cupertino Bureau, covering suburban local news, a demotion so unmistakable in meaning that every journalist in the country who hears about it understands what has happened. He resigns rather than accept the assignment permanently. The resignation is the outcome the transfer was designed to produce without the legal and labor complications of a direct termination. When he applies for jobs after leaving the Mercury News, the 1997 editor's note from Jerry Seppos, the note that expresses regret about the presentation of Dark Alliance without retracting its documented findings, is the document that closes the doors. Editors read the note as a partial retraction. They call it a retraction in the shorthand that the controversy generates. Webb is the reporter whose own paper backed away from his story. Hiring him is a reputational risk that newspaper editors in 1998 and 1999 and 2000 are not willing to take, and the 1998 CIA IG report confirming his core findings does not change this calculus, because the IG report itself receives only 1 day of coverage before disappearing. Webb describes his professional situation in conversations with friends and colleagues during these years in terms that are consistent across multiple accounts. He feels that his career is finished. He has done the most important work of his professional life. The work turns out to be correct. The correctness is officially confirmed, and none of this changes the fact that he cannot get a job at a newspaper. He is trapped in a specific and unusual hell, being right about something important, having official confirmation of his rightness, and having that rightness produce no professional rehabilitation. The specific cruelty of Webb's position in the years between the 1998 IG report and his death in 2004 is worth understanding precisely. He is not a man who is broadly discredited. His pre-Dark Alliance career is solid and documented, and people who know his work understand its quality. He is a man whose specific investigation, the most important work he ever does, the work that turns out to be confirmed by a 400-page CIA report, is the thing that follows his name and closes the doors. The 1997 Mercury News editor's note is the document that functions as the closing mechanism. Editors who encounter Webb's name encounter the note, read it as a retraction, and file him under discredited. The IG report that vindicates the reporting receives 1 day of coverage. The editor's note that partially distances the Mercury News from its implications is cited for decades. The asymmetry is precise and devastating. The document that damages Webb is brief, widely circulated, and easily summarized. The document that vindicates him is 400 pages long and buried on a Thursday before Columbus Day. The information architecture of his destruction is more durable than the information architecture of his vindication. This is not an accident. It is how institutional information management works when it works. The CIA's media operation has accomplished what it sets out to accomplish. The destruction is complete enough that the confirmation of the story does not undo it. On December 10, 2004, Webb's neighbor finds a note on the front door of his house in Carmichael asking the neighbor to call a moving company and saying the key is under the mat. The neighbor enters the house and finds Gary Webb dead in his bedroom. He has been shot twice in the head. The Sacramento County coroner conducts an investigation and rules the death a suicide. The coroner confirms that both wounds are self-inflicted and that the cause of death is the gunshot wounds. 2 gunshot wounds to the head in a self-inflicted death is what creates the difficulty in accepting the ruling, not because it is impossible, but because it is unusual enough that it generates questions that the Sacramento County authorities answer by maintaining their ruling without additional public explanation. Forensic pathologists who are asked about the case note that 2 self-inflicted head wounds are rare. The first wound typically produces either death or immediate incapacitation, but acknowledge that they occur in documented cases and that the ruling is not, on its face, impossible. The ruling stands. Webb's family does not accept it. His mother, Anita Webb, his ex-wife, Sue Bell, and his children dispute the ruling. They acknowledge the circumstances of his life in the weeks before his death, the depression, the financial desperation, the professional isolation that had become permanent as consistent with suicidal ideation. What they dispute is the physical mechanics of the death itself. They ask for an independent review. Sacramento County does not reopen the case. What is not in dispute is the life that preceded the death. Gary Webb in December 2004 is a man who does the work a reporter is supposed to do with primary sources and documented methodology, publishes findings that the CIA's own Inspector General confirms 6 years later, and has his career destroyed not by the facts of his reporting but by the institutional response to his reporting. He loses his position. He loses his investigative platform. He loses the income that sustains his family. He loses his house. He cannot find work in the profession he has practiced for his entire adult life. The posthumous recognition arrives slowly and incompletely. In 2014, the film Kill the Messenger is released, directed by Michael Cuesta and starring Jeremy Renner as Gary Webb. The film draws extensively from Webb's own account, from Nick Skou's biography Kill the Messenger, and from the documented record of the Dark Alliance investigation and its aftermath. It is a mainstream Hollywood film, released by Universal Pictures, and its release prompts a wave of retrospective coverage in which journalists and editors grapple unevenly with the question of what the national press did to Gary Webb and why. Some of the retrospective coverage is genuinely self-critical. Some of it focuses on the CIA's coordination of the press campaign against Webb with the kind of outrage that would have been more useful in 1996. Much of it carefully avoids naming specific journalists at specific papers as participants in Webb's destruction, even though the IG's documentation of the CIA's press coordination is specific enough to make such identification possible. The retrospective coverage gives the story a second life in the public consciousness. It does not produce accountability for anyone. In the retrospective coverage surrounding the film, some of the reporters who wrote the 1996 and 1997 critical pieces speak publicly about the experience. A few acknowledge in careful language that the national press might have been more vigorous in independently investigating the underlying documented facts rather than focusing on Webb's methodology. None of them use language like "I was wrong" or "I participated in destroying a correct investigation." The language is the language of institutional review rather than personal accountability, the language that acknowledges a systemic problem while ensuring that no specific individual carries the weight of it. Webb is dead. He cannot accept the partial acknowledgement or dispute the framing of it. The retrospective conversation happens without the person whose career it destroyed and whose vindication it is, nominally, commemorating. The people who participate in his destruction face nothing. They continue their careers. Some of them are still working. Webb is buried in Indianapolis. The Sacramento County coroner's ruling is final. The case is closed. He was right about everything that mattered. It cost him everything he had. Event 12, the sentencing disparity. Who went to prison and for how long? 1986-2018. Is 1986. Congress passes the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. The law creates mandatory minimum sentences for federal cocaine offenses. It creates the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Under the law, possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine triggers a mandatory minimum of 5 years in federal prison. Possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine, 100 times the quantity, triggers the identical 5-year mandatory minimum. Distribution thresholds follow the same formula at every tier. The disparity applies uniformly. It takes 100 times as much powder cocaine as crack cocaine to trigger the same sentence under federal law. The law is passed in response to the crack epidemic. Congress is reacting to the visible catastrophe in communities like South Central Los Angeles, the violence, the addiction rates, the community destruction, the deaths. These are real. Congress is not wrong that the crack epidemic is causing devastation on a scale that demands legislative response. What Congress does not do in passing the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 is investigate how the epidemic's supply chain is structured, where the cocaine is coming from, what role government programs and government decisions play in creating the conditions for it. The Kerry Committee investigation that would document this is still 3 years from publication. The CIA Inspector General investigation that confirms it is 12 years from completion. Congress passes the law it knows how to pass, in response to the crisis it understands through its visible effects, without access to the documented facts about its causes. The racial mathematics of the 100-to-1 disparity are visible within months of the law's passage. Crack cocaine in 1986 is used predominantly in black communities and sold predominantly by black dealers. Powder cocaine is used in higher proportions by white Americans and by people with higher incomes. This is not a disputed sociological finding. It is documented in arrest data, in treatment admission records, in the demographic profile of federal cocaine prosecutions in every year from 1986 onward. The law creates a 2-tiered sentencing structure for the same underlying drug molecule that produces dramatically longer sentences for black defendants than for white defendants convicted of equivalent underlying conduct. A black man with 5 grams of crack serves 5 years under federal mandatory minimums. A white man with 5 grams of powder is not subject to the mandatory minimum at all. The United States Sentencing Commission's 1995 report on the crack powder disparity is among the most clearly worded official documents on racial inequity in the American criminal justice system produced in the 20th century. The Commission finds that black defendants represent approximately 83% of federal crack cocaine defendants in the years since the law's passage. It finds that the average sentence for a crack cocaine offense is significantly longer than the average sentence for a powder cocaine offense involving equivalent quantities. It finds that the disparity has no pharmacological justification. Crack and powder cocaine are the same molecule with different delivery mechanisms, and no logical justification in terms of the comparative harms of the two forms. The Commission recommends equalizing the penalties. Congress declines. In 1995, Congress takes the extraordinary step of formally rejecting the Sentencing Commission's recommended guideline revisions, the only time in history Congress exercises this power. The rejection is bipartisan. It is unanimous in the Senate. The disparity stays. 83% of the people serving time under it are black. The United States Sentencing Commission, whose statutory purpose is to promote rationality and consistency in federal sentencing, begins reviewing the crack powder disparity within years of its enactment. The Commission's 1995 report concludes that the disparity is racially inequitable in its application and recommends equalization of the sentencing structure. Congress declines to act. The Commission issues similar findings in 1997 and 2002, with updated data confirming the same pattern. Congress again declines to act. The Commission has no authority to change the law. It can only report what the law produces and recommend changes to the institution that enacted it. The institution declines. The crack cocaine producing these sentences, the cocaine that flows through the Blandon Menezes supply chain to Ricky Ross and through Ross's distribution network across South Central, is the cocaine whose supply chain the CIA declines to report under the protection of the 1982 MOU. The mandatory minimums are applied to the people at the bottom of that supply chain with the full weight of federal law. The people at the top of the supply chain receive cooperation deals, early release, and government employment. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduces the disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. The act is not retroactive. The people serving sentences imposed under the original disparity, including people serving terms imposed by judges who state publicly in their sentencing remarks that they consider the sentence unjust and disproportionate but lack the legal authority to impose something different, are not released. The United States Sentencing Commission estimates that approximately 13,000 prisoners are serving sentences under the 100 to 1 structure that would have been substantially shorter under the 2010 law. The First Step Act of 2018 allows prisoners sentenced under the original disparity to petition for sentence reductions. The petition process is not automatic, not swift, and does not make anyone whole for the years already served. It is, in the language of criminal justice reform, a step. It acknowledges the injustice without remedying it completely. Between 1986 and 2010, 24 years, the 100 to 1 disparity is the legal structure through which the American criminal justice system processes the crack cocaine epidemic. During these 24 years, approximately 80% of federal crack cocaine defendants are black, as the Sentencing Commission documents in multiple reports. The mandatory minimum sentences remove judicial discretion entirely. The judge cannot consider the individual defendant's circumstances. The judge cannot weigh the specific role the defendant plays in the distribution chain. The 5-year sentence is the 5-year sentence whether the defendant is a kingpin or a courier with 5 grams in his pocket. Federal judges who believe the sentence is disproportionate and unjust say so, in some cases explicitly, in their sentencing remarks, and then impose the mandatory minimum anyway, because the law does not allow them to do otherwise. The law treats everyone subject to it with the same mechanical force, applied to a drug whose supply chain runs from Colombian cartels through Contra-connected Nicaraguan exiles through a warehouse in Los Angeles, and whose legal consequences fall entirely on the people at the bottom of that chain. The specific individuals who serve the longest sentences for the crack that Blandon and Menezes supply are not named in any document you are likely to encounter. They are case numbers in federal court records. They are numbers in the Sentencing Commission's statistical reports. They are names on visiting room lists in federal prisons from Victorville, California to Terre Haute, Indiana to Memphis, Tennessee. Some of them have been in federal prison since 1988 or 1989 or 1990, since before Ross was even convicted, since before the Kerry Committee report was published, since before Dark Alliance exists, since before the CIA IG's investigation begins. They are still serving sentences for a supply chain whose top end the CIA protects under a memorandum the public does not know about until Gary Webb obtains it through a FOIA request in 1995. Danilo Blandon, whose cocaine helps create the epidemic that produces the legislation, is on the DEA payroll when the Fair Sentencing Act passes. He lives in the United States. He has not been prosecuted in the United States for his role in the crack epidemic. Norwin Menezes serves his time in Nicaragua. He is not prosecuted in the United States. Ricky Ross is released in 2009 after a federal judge reduces his sentence following the disclosure of the full Blandon story. He spends his post-prison years giving talks about criminal justice reform, about the crack epidemic and his role in it, about what happened to South Central and why. He is articulate and specific, and in the accounts of people who hear him, genuinely reckoning with what his operation produced in the neighborhood he grew up in. He cannot undo what he did. He tries to say what it was. He is one of the very few people connected to this story at any level who has done anything like that. The people serving the longest sentences for the crack that Blandon and Meanies' supply are the people who bought from Ross and sold to their neighbors. They are in federal prisons across the United States. Some of them have served 25 or 30 years. Some of them are still there. 5 grams, mandatory minimum, 5 years, for the product that the CIA declines to report under a memorandum signed by 2 men who are never charged with anything. The human face of the disparity is not in the statistics alone. It is in the specific way mandatory minimum sentences operate in the federal courtroom, the way they remove the judge from the equation. Federal judges in the 1980s and 1990s who impose crack cocaine mandatory minimums frequently state on the record that they consider the sentence disproportionate to the offense in the specific case before them. They note the defendant's lack of prior criminal history. They note the defendant's role as a peripheral participant in a larger conspiracy. They note the specific circumstances of the case, and then they impose the mandatory minimum because they have no legal authority to do otherwise. The law has removed their discretion. The 5-year sentence is the 5-year sentence regardless of what the judge thinks about it. This is the design of the mandatory minimum structure to ensure consistency by eliminating judgment. What it produces in the context of the crack powder disparity is the consistent application of an inequitable standard to a population that is disproportionately black, by judges who in many cases publicly object to the result they are legally compelled to produce. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduces the disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. The First Step Act of 2018 makes it retroactive. Between those two laws, thousands of people receive reduced sentences for convictions that should have produced shorter terms. The process is not automatic. It requires petitions. It requires hearings. It requires the participation of attorneys, many of them public defenders working at capacity in understaffed offices. The years already served are not returned. The families disrupted during those years are not made whole. The communities that lose fathers and mothers and siblings to mandatory minimums built on an unjust disparity do not get those years back either. The accounting runs downward through the supply chain to the people least able to resist it and stops there. It always stops there. That is the pattern. That is what this video has documented. The crack cocaine epidemic in South Central Los Angeles has a supply chain. The supply chain connects, through documented court testimony and DEA files and congressional investigation, to the CIA's Contra program. The connection is established in the Kerry Committee report of 1989, in Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series of 1996, and in the CIA Inspector General's report of 1998. These are 3 independent evidentiary sources reaching the same documented finding across 9 years of investigation. The 1982 CIA-DOJ Memorandum of Understanding creates the legal framework within which the CIA can know about this trafficking and face no obligation to report it to law enforcement. The document exists. The Inspector General confirms it. The FOIA request that surfaces it is in the public record. The Attorney General and the CIA Director sign it, and both die before they face any legal accounting for what they create with it. Gary Webb documents all of this with primary sources and is destroyed for it by a coordinated response that includes the CIA's own public affairs office providing information and framing to reporters at major national newspapers. The CIA's own Inspector General documents this coordination. Webb loses his job, his career, his marriage, and his house. He is found dead in December 2004 with 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The ruling is suicide. The people who participate in his destruction face nothing. The CIA officials who coordinate the media campaign against him continue their careers. The reporters who write the critical pieces continue their careers. The Mercury News editors who create the conditions for his resignation continue their careers. None of them ever publicly acknowledge in any forum that they participated in the professional destruction of a reporter who turned out to be confirmed correct by the agency he was reporting on. The 100 to 1 sentencing disparity runs for 24 years. Hundreds of thousands of predominantly black Americans serve sentences under it for the product that the CIA-connected supply chain makes available. Danilo Blandon collects a DEA salary. Norwin Menezes serves his Nicaraguan sentence. Ricky Ross is released in 2009. The communities of South Central Los Angeles and the dozens of cities that the supply chain reaches are still living in the aftermath of the epidemic it produces. The Sentencing Commission estimates that approximately 13,000 federal prisoners are serving sentences under the 100-to-1 structure that would have been substantially shorter under the 2010 law when the First Step Act makes retroactivity available in 2018. 13,000. That is the floor, the number of people whose specific sentence length is provably attributable to the disparity, who are still incarcerated when retroactivity finally arrives, and who can petition for reduction. The number does not include the people who served their full sentences in the years between 1986 and 2010 and are released before the Fair Sentencing Act passes. It does not include the people who die in federal custody. It does not include the people whose sentences produce collateral consequences, lost jobs, lost housing, lost child custody, that the sentence reduction cannot touch because it arrives after the consequence is already permanent. The petition process for First Step Act relief is not automatic. It requires legal work. It requires a motion filed in federal court. It requires a judge to review the case and calculate what the sentence would have been under the 2010 law. For people without attorneys, which is most federal prisoners, because there is no constitutional right to appointed counsel in post-conviction proceedings, the process requires navigating a federal court system from inside a federal prison on a government-issued computer with limited internet access. Many petitions succeed. Many others do not get filed because the person who should file them does not know the right exists or cannot access the resources to pursue it. The supply chain that produces the product those sentences punish runs from Colombian cocaine sources through Norwin Menezes and Danilo Blandon through Ricky Ross through South Central Los Angeles. The CIA knows about the top of that chain. The 1982 memo says the CIA does not have to tell anyone. The mandatory minimums say the people at the bottom of the chain serve 5 years for 5 grams. This is the documented structure of American drug enforcement as it operates in the 1980s. The documents are in the archives. The sentences are in the bodies of the people who served them. The people who kept this story alive are Celerino Castillo, who documents what he sees from El Salvador and files the reports and gets no response and writes a book and testifies before Congress and keeps saying what he saw. Jack Blum, who spends 3 years building the Kerry Committee record and watches it disappear, and then tells Gary Webb in 1995 that he is on the right track and to keep going. Gary Webb, who assembles the court records and the sworn testimony and the DEA files and the 1982 memo into a documented narrative that the CIA confirms 6 years later, and who pays for the documentation with everything he had. And Maxine Waters, the congresswoman who represents South Central and who demands an investigation in 1996 when the press is still deciding whether to cover the story or attack the reporter, and who does not stop. These are the people who make it possible to tell this story at all, not the institutions, which behave exactly as institutions protecting themselves from accountability behave. The individuals who decide that what they know cannot be buried, the ones who make the calculation that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of saying it, the ones who say it anyway. Gary Webb makes that calculation. He says what he knows. He pays the cost. The documents he leaves behind are the reason this video exists. History is not what happened. History is what we choose to remember, to teach, and to demand accountability for. The rest is what powerful people hope you forget. Don't forget. If this video reached you, share it, subscribe, leave a comment with the event that hit you hardest. Come back for the next one, because there are more.